December 22nd, 1944. Bastogne, Belgium. 4 German soldiers walk out of the frozen tree line. They are waving white flags. They cross no man's land slowly, deliberately, their boots crunching through snow that has turned the Belgian countryside into a white graveyard. American soldiers in foxholes watch them come. The Germans are immaculate, long greatcoats, polished black boots. One of them, a lieutenant named Helmuth Henke, speaks perfect English. He approaches the first American he sees, a young soldier named PFC Leo Palma, and says, "We want to see your commanding officer." What he's carrying in his briefcase will change the course of the war, and the answer it receives, a single word, 4 letters long, will echo through history forever. If you want more stories like this one, real stories told the way they actually happened, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. There are thousands of these moments buried in history, and we're going to find every single one of them. To understand what's happening in that Belgian field on December 22nd, 1944, you have to understand what the previous 6 days had looked like for the Allied forces. 6 days earlier, December 16th, 1944, Adolf Hitler had rolled the dice on the most audacious gamble of the entire war. It was 5:30 in the morning. Across an 80-mile front in the Ardennes forest, more than 400,000 German soldiers and over 1,000 armored vehicles burst through the American lines in total darkness, catching the Allies completely off guard. The attack came through terrain everyone had considered impassable, a thick, snow-choked forest of steep ridges and narrow roads, exactly where the Germans had struck in 1940 to conquer France in 6 weeks. Hitler's plan was simple in outline, nearly insane in ambition. Drive west, cross the Meuse River, capture the port of Antwerp, split the Allied armies in 2, force a negotiated peace before the spring. It was called Operation Watch on the Rhine. The Allies would call it the Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest single battle American forces would fight in the entire war. For the first few days, it looked like it might work. American units were overrun. Communication lines were cut. Soldiers were taken prisoner by the thousands. The front, carefully built up over months of hard fighting, collapsed inward like a crushed tin can. German panzer columns raced west through the fog and snow, their commanders barely believing how far they were penetrating. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, took one look at his maps and made 2 decisions instantly. First, the paratroopers. He ordered the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, both elite, both battle-hardened, to move into Belgium immediately, without delay. The 82nd would go to St. Vith. The 101st would go to a small Belgian crossroads town called Bastogne. Why Bastogne? Because 7 major roads converged there. 7 roads through impossible terrain. If the Germans captured Bastogne, their armor could fan out in every direction. If the Allies held it, the entire German timetable fell apart. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, arrived in Bastogne on December 18th and 19th, trucked in through the night in open vehicles, many of them without winter gear, without galoshes, some without even enough ammunition. They had been pulled from reserve positions and thrown directly into the path of the most powerful armored force Germany had assembled since the early days of the war. They were outnumbered, they were outgunned, and within 3 days they would be completely surrounded. The man commanding them was not even supposed to be in charge. The 101st's commanding general, Maxwell Taylor, was in Washington, D.C. attending a conference. His deputy, General Gerald Higgins, was in England attending a lecture series. Command had devolved to the artillery commander, a 46-year-old brigadier general named Anthony Clement McAuliffe. Anthony McAuliffe was born in Washington, D.C. on July 2, 1898, the eldest of 6 children in an Irish-American family. He was the kind of man who seemed built for soldiering, methodical, calm, with a dry sense of humor that masked a will of iron. He graduated from West Point in 1918, commissioned into the field artillery, and spent the interwar years doing what career officers did in peacetime: training, studying, preparing. When World War II came, McAuliffe was ready. He parachuted into Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944, with the lead element of the 101st's Artillery Headquarters Group. He fought in Holland during Operation Market Garden just 3 months later, landing by glider at Eindhoven. He had been in combat. He had seen what war looked like up close. But nothing quite prepared him for what December 1944 in Bastogne was going to demand. By December 21st, the Germans had closed the ring. Bastogne was surrounded. The 101st, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division and other attached units, roughly 18,000 men in total, were cut off from all land supply routes. The weather was savage. Temperatures dropped well below freezing. A thick overcast had settled over the Ardennes, grounding Allied aircraft and eliminating the possibility of air supply or close air support. Ammunition was running low. Medical supplies were nearly gone. On December 19th, the Germans had captured the 326th Airborne Medical Company near Bastogne, 11 officers and over 100 enlisted men taken prisoner, gutting the division's medical capability exactly when casualties were flooding in. The men in the foxholes were cold, exhausted, and hungry. Some didn't have enough shells to fire their artillery. Surgeons were operating with almost no equipment. At night, the temperature plunged and the ground froze so hard that digging new defensive positions was nearly impossible. McAuliffe looked at all of this, and his judgment was clear. His men were giving the Germans, in his own words, one hell of a beating. He believed they could hold. He believed Patton's Third Army was coming from the south. He believed that Bastogne, however bad things looked, was not lost. He was right. But he didn't know yet that the Germans were about to try to convince him otherwise. On the morning of December 22nd, at roughly 11:30, the 4 Germans crossed the American line near the Kessler farm on the Arlon Road, south of Bastogne. PFC Leo Palma saw them first. Staff Sergeant Carl Dickinson walked out to meet them. The Germans explained they had a written message for the American commander. They consented to being blindfolded. They had even brought their own blindfolds. Dickinson and a German-speaking medic named PFC Ernest Premetz escorted the 2 German officers, Major Wagner and Lieutenant Henke, on a roundabout route to Company F's command post. From there, the message began working its way up the chain of command, reaching division headquarters in Bastogne. At division headquarters, Acting Chief of Staff Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore entered McAuliffe's sleeping quarters and woke him. McAuliffe was half asleep when Moore told him, "The Germans have sent some people forward to take our surrender." McAuliffe's eyes opened. "Us surrender?" he said, and then, dropping back toward his sleeping bag, "Aw, nuts." Moore went back out to brief the rest of the staff. He told them what McAuliffe had said. Everyone laughed. When the message finally made it to McAuliffe himself, he looked at it, read the demand, and dropped it on the floor. He left division headquarters to go congratulate a unit on the western perimeter that had just destroyed a German roadblock. But the 2 blindfolded German officers were still waiting at the Company F command post. They had delivered a formal demand. They expected a formal reply. Under the laws of war, they were entitled to one. When McAuliffe returned, he was told the Germans were still waiting. He asked Colonel Harper, the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment commander, to come see him. McAuliffe sat with his staff and wondered aloud, "Well, I don't know what to tell them." It was Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, the division operations officer, who said it. "What you said initially would be hard to beat, sir." McAuliffe looked at him. "What do you mean?" "You said nuts, sir." The room erupted. Every officer present immediately agreed. McAuliffe took out a message pad and wrote it down. He handed it to a clerk typist and said, "Have it typed up." The reply was centered on a full sheet of paper. It read, "December 22nd, 1944 to the German commander, NUTS." The American commander McAuliffe handed the message to Colonel Harper and asked him to deliver it personally. Harper said it would be his pleasure. Harper found the 2 blindfolded German officers standing in the woods, under guard, waiting for their answer. He placed the typed reply directly into the hand of Major Wagner. Lieutenant Henke asked if it was affirmative or negative. "The reply," Harper said, "is decidedly not affirmative." Henke didn't understand. Harper leaned in. "If you don't understand what nuts means, in plain English, it's the same as go to hell." He paused, then added, "And I will tell you something else. If you continue to attack, we will kill every goddamn German that tries to break into this city." The two German officers removed their blindfolds. They opened the note. They stared at it. Henke looked up at Harper. "We will kill many Americans," he said quietly. "This is war." "On your way," Harper said, "and good luck to you." As the Germans walked away, Harper called after them one final time. "If you don't know what I mean, just tell your commanding officer to go to hell." The major got angry. He stormed off. As he passed Palma's foxhole, he threw his blindfold to the ground. Palma caught it. He later used it to clean his bar rifle and threw it away, never realizing, as he later admitted, the historical importance of what he'd been holding. Now, what happened when those two German officers brought the answer back? This is the part of the story that most people never hear. The Germans drove to the 901st Panzer Grenadier Regimental headquarters at Lutrebos. On the way to the Panzer Lehr Division's headquarters, a mile further south, they spotted the car of General Hasso von Manteuffel, the commander of the entire 5th Panzer Army, parked by a thicket of trees. Major Wagner stopped and reported to him directly. What happened next revealed something extraordinary about the German side of this story. Von Manteuffel was surprised. He had not authorized any surrender demand. In post-war interviews with Allied interrogators, he said it directly. The Panzer Lehr Division had sent those men into Bastogne without his knowledge, without his permission. He didn't know who had authorized it, and he was still unsure years later. The demand had been improvised, a local initiative. The man most likely behind it was General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, commander of the XL7th Panzer Corps, who had ordered the Panzer Lehr Division to push the ultimatum forward. When the German officers arrived at the Panzer Lehr headquarters and the Nuts reply was presented, General Fritz Bayerlein, the Panzer Lehr commander, a veteran of the Afrika Korps and Normandy, said immediately that it was time to start striking with the heavy artillery behind the hill. Von Luttwitz interrupted him. The heavy artillery, he explained, was no longer there. It had already been moved forward, past Bastogne. Bayerlein started to explain how he would attack without it. Von Luttwitz interrupted again. Bastogne, he reminded Bayerlein, was not the Panzer Lehr Division's objective anymore. Their orders were to go around Bastogne, push west to Rochefort, and leave Bastogne to the 26th Volksgrenadier Division. And so the most powerful German armored division in the sector was ordered to bypass the town they could not take. The threatened artillery barrage, the 6 heavy anti-aircraft battalions, and the 1 German artillery corps, promised in the surrender demand, never materialized. Instead, that night, the German Luftwaffe flew bombing missions against Bastogne, targeting military and civilian alike. Buildings burned, civilian casualties mounted, the town was battered, but the 101st held the perimeter. General Heinz Kokott, commanding the 26th Volksgrenadier Division left behind to deal with Bastogne, later wrote in his after-action notes that when the reply came back, it was fully in accord with the stubborn tenacity displayed by the defending forces. He had expected nothing less. He had watched these Americans fight for days. He knew what he was dealing with. On Christmas Eve, McAuliffe did something remarkable. He wrote a message to his men. Not a tactical order, not a logistics report, a letter. Addressed to the soldiers freezing in their foxholes, the surgeons operating without supplies, the artillerymen rationing shells, the paratroopers holding positions against an enemy that outnumbered them on every side. He told them about the German demand, he told them what he had said, and then he told them what they had accomplished. He wrote that they had stopped cold everything thrown at them from the north, east, south, and west. He wrote that they had identified soldiers from 4 German panzer divisions, 2 infantry divisions, and 1 parachute division. He wrote that these units, the spearhead of what he called the last desperate German lunge, had been heading straight west when the 101st was ordered to stop them. He wrote, "How effectively this was done will be written in history, not alone in our division's glorious history, but in world history." He signed it, "A Merry Christmas." Later that night, on the phone with his superior General Middleton, McAuliffe was more direct about what he actually wanted for Christmas. "The finest Christmas present the 101st could get," he said privately, "would be a relief tomorrow." He wasn't far off. On December 23rd, the overcast broke. For 8 days, the weather had been the Germans' greatest ally. Fog and clouds so thick that Allied aircraft couldn't fly, couldn't drop supplies, couldn't attack the German columns that were squeezing Bastogne from every side. On December 23rd, the sky cleared. Allied C-47 transport planes appeared over Bastogne. Hundreds of parachutes blossomed open above the frozen fields. Men who had been rationing their last shells, who had been searching dead enemies for ammunition, ran across open ground under fire to retrieve the bundles, medical supplies, ammunition, food. The 101st could fight again. And from the south, one of the greatest military maneuvers in American history was already underway. When the German breakthrough began on December 16th, General George S. Patton's Third Army had been fighting in the Sarre region of France, pointed east toward Germany. In one of the most audacious tactical pivots in military history, Patton turned his entire army, several 100,000 men, hundreds of tanks, 90 degrees to the north, drove them through ice and snow and fog along roads barely capable of handling the traffic, and began a drive toward Bastogne that no one, including many of his own officers, thought was physically possible. He made it possible. Leading the push was the 4th Armored Division, one of Patton's favorites. Hard, experienced, aggressive. They fought their way mile by mile through the Belgian countryside, through German roadblocks and minefields and bitter rearguard actions, through snow and darkness and conditions that would have stopped almost any other force. At exactly 4:45 in the afternoon on December 26th, 4 days after McAuliffe sent his 4-letter reply, Company C of the 37th Tank Battalion made contact with Lieutenant Webster of the 326th Engineers, 101st Airborne Division, near the village of Bastogne. The siege of Bastogne was lifted. Men who had been fighting for 8 days without sleep, without enough food, in temperatures that turned their wounds to ice before the medics could reach them, those men heard the sound of American tanks and wept. Patton's relief of Bastogne was later described as one of the most impressive military movements in American history. He had moved his army farther and faster, against greater resistance than almost any comparable force in the war. But none of it would have mattered if the 101st had not held. In the days that followed, the story of the Nuts reply began to spread. An Associated Press correspondent named Don Whitehead filed a report. A United Press reporter named Ned Ball confirmed it. The headline appeared in newspapers across America, on front pages from coast to coast. The name Anthony McAuliffe, which almost no one outside the military had ever heard 4 weeks earlier, became a household word overnight. General McAuliffe's Nuts, one of classics of this war, the Richmond Times-Dispatch declared on its front page. On January 2nd, McAuliffe himself traveled to Eisenhower's headquarters to brief the assembled press corps firsthand. Every wire service sent the story. What stood out to every reporter present was not just the word itself, it was the attitude behind it. McAuliffe spoke for every man who had held Bastogne when he told the press corps. He never asked for help. He screamed about only one thing, and that had to do with casualties. They needed surgeons out there. No boasting. No drama. Just the facts, delivered the way a man delivers facts when he knows exactly what he did and why. McAuliffe was promoted to Major General. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. He was given command of the 103rd Infantry Division, which he led into Germany. After the war, he remained in the Army for years, eventually rising to commander of United States Army Europe, the same theater where, in one Belgian winter, he had become a legend. He died on August 11, 1975, in Washington, D.C. He was 77 years old. The town of Bastogne named its central square after him. It is called Place McAuliffe today. His statue stands there. The Battle of the Bulge continued until January 25, 1945. It cost the United States more than 76,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. It was the most costly single battle American forces fought in the entire war. Germany suffered over 100,000 casualties and lost hundreds of tanks and vehicles it could not replace. The Wehrmacht was never able to reconstitute the armored force it spent on that offensive. From that point forward, there was only one direction the war would go. The German High Command, the men who received that 4-letter reply, knew what it meant. Not immediately. Henke had asked, genuinely confused, whether the American commander's answer was affirmative or negative. But in the broader sense, they understood. General Cocotte had written it in his own words. It was fully in accord with the stubborn tenacity of those defenders. They had surrounded 18,000 Americans. They had cut off their supplies. They had promised annihilation. They had demanded, formally in writing, under a flag of truce, that those men surrender with honor, because that was the only option left, and they had received 4 letters in response. NUTS. Not a speech, not a declaration, not a formal diplomatic refusal. Just a word. The first word that came to an artilleryman's lips when someone told him to quit. There is something in that word that goes beyond the story itself. What McAuliffe understood, what every man in those frozen foxholes understood, was that there are moments when the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to accept someone else's definition of your situation. The Germans had written their ultimatum in the confident language of arithmetic. More men, more tanks, more artillery. The numbers, they said, admitted of only one conclusion. McAuliffe looked at the same numbers and drew a different conclusion entirely. He believed in his men, he believed in their training, he believed in what they had already done. And he believed, even when the weather was savage and the ammunition was running low and the medics were working without supplies, that they could hold. He was right. The men of the 101st Airborne who held Bastogne in those 8 days didn't just slow the German advance. They helped break it. Every hour the Germans spent pressing against that perimeter was an hour Patton's army was driving north. Every shell the Germans fired at Bastogne was a shell that didn't reach some other part of the line. Every division tied up around that crossroads town was a division that couldn't exploit the breakthrough to the west. Bastogne was the stopper in the bottle. And the man who kept it in place answered a formal surrender demand with a word he wouldn't have said in front of a lady. Think about that, the next time someone tells you the odds are against you. Think about a general half asleep in a Belgian barracks, told that the enemy wanted his men to quit, and his first instinct, before he was even fully awake, was to laugh. Think about the soldiers in those foxholes on Christmas Eve, reading a message from their commander that said, "What we are doing here will be written in world history." They were cold and hungry and exhausted and scared, and they held. History doesn't remember the men who surrendered when the odds were against them. History remembers the ones who sent back 4 letters and dug in. Nuts. If this story moved you, if you think the men of the 101st Airborne deserve to be remembered, please take a second and subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment telling us which part of this story got you the most. Was it McAuliffe's answer? The German reaction when they heard it? Patton's drive through the snow? And hit that bell so you never miss one of these stories. There are thousands more waiting, because the men who fought these battles, they deserve to be heard.